the god! I am the god!
A king murdered in his own palace. A labyrinth said to hold thousands of hidden rooms. Secret letters buried for 3,000 years. And a harem conspiracy that nearly tore Egypt apart. These are the secrets of the Pharaoh's palace, where power and danger lived side by side. This episode is our path into the palace of the Pharaoh, into hidden rooms and ritual chambers, into the ceremonies that tied kings to gods. But what do we really know? And what remains a mystery? Let's step inside. Ancient Egyptian palaces were centers of rule, ritual, and culture. Unlike temples and tombs made of stone, palaces were mud brick. They were plastered, painted bright, and less durable. Most collapsed over time, leaving only traces. Even so, their layouts still show power and meaning. Palaces had wide courts and columned halls. They held private rooms, gardens, storerooms, and chapels. Amenhotep III built one of the largest at Malkata in the 14th century BC. It was called Per-He, the House of Rejoicing, and it spread across the west bank of Thebes with halls, villas, and a temple for Amun. It was linked to the Nile by canals and sat beside a huge man-made lake. That lake was probably dug for his Sed festival around year 30 of his reign. The king likely sailed it as a ritual of renewal, becoming one with Re. The palace was arranged as a stage for cosmic ceremony. Architecture reinforced this order. New kingdom palaces had the window of appearances. Here, the pharaoh stood like a god before his people. Also at Amarna, Akhenaten's ceremonial palace was joined to his home by a bridge. He and Nefertiti stood on it, tossing gold to their courtiers. And at Medinet Habu, Ramesses III built a palace with a carved stone window. The throne room there had fitted grills. Behind it lay a columned hall with a dais, showing the king as giver of life and wealth. Decoration drove the point home. Walls and floors carried images of power. Faience tiles near the king's window showed Nubians, Asiatics, and Libyans. As for Amarna's North Palace, plaster floors showed bound prisoners. They wore distinct clothes and had their hands tied. The Egyptians even painted skin tones differently to mark ethnicity. These were symbols. They showed Egypt ruling all lands. And each time the king crossed the floor or sat on his throne, he stamped enemies underfoot. The palace itself was a map of the universe, with Egypt at the center. But palaces were also places of daily life, for they had bathrooms and lavatories, which was rare in the ancient world. Cleanliness mattered for comfort and for ritual. The tale of Sinuhe tells of his return. I was taken to a princely mansion. There was a bathroom. I was shaved, my hair combed, wrapped in linen, anointed with fine oil. Purification was part of the welcome. Records say visitors had to wash, shave, remove sandals, and wear scented ointment. Servants even had titles like priest of the hands. They worked like a priesthood, treating service as sacred duty. So, in that sense, the palace itself was a temple, and etiquette was a ritual. If the palace looked powerful on the outside, the inside was full of mystery. The best case is the Labyrinth of Hawara, a Middle Kingdom complex so huge that Herodotus said its halls went on forever. In the 1800s, Flinders Petrie dug up its foundations, and found shrines and courts. But no secret chambers were found below. Maybe the Egyptians sealed them to guard burials or treasures. Or maybe there are still hidden rooms under the sand, though no proof has ever shown up. And you know, some hidden spaces had practical jobs. At Amarna, brick stamps called one building the place of the correspondence of Pharaoh. In 1887, villagers found a stash of clay tablets there. These were the Amarna letters, messages from Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, and others. They were part of the royal archive. So, imagine it's the year 1350 BC. Envoys hand over tablets covered in cuneiform. Then a scribe reads them out loud, calling the king, "The sun, my lord." Scholars think this was theatre, proof of Egypt's global reach. And when the show was done, the letters were shelved, and they stayed hidden for 3,300 years, until a farmer dug them up. But not every secret was meant to last. In 1155 BC, the palace faced the harem conspiracy. It was a scandal during Ramesses III's reign. The judicial papyrus of Turin tells how insiders plotted to kill the king and crown a prince. The plot unfolded inside the women's quarters at Medinet Habu. It turned the most private rooms of the palace into the stage for treason. Then, during a festival, the conspirators sneaked into restricted areas and attacked Ramesses III. His mummy shows a fatal throat wound, so the strike likely worked, even if the coup failed. Afterwards, dozens of people were tried and executed, from butlers to chamberlains to the harem overseer. Anyhow, the affair shows two things. First, private palace areas were so locked down that only insiders could get in. Second, even the bedchamber could turn into a crime scene. The papyrus is incomplete, however, so details are missing. Historians still argue over whether the women took part, and if the magic spells in the text were actually tried. But what about escape tunnels? Stories suggest pharaohs may have built them, but evidence is scarce. Some New Kingdom palaces had cellars or spaces under floors, which were probably used for storage or cooling. To date, no real tunnels have been found. Still, it's easy to imagine a hidden door behind a throne. So, if those passages ever existed, they remain undiscovered, and whole palaces themselves are still buried. Royal cities like Pi-Ramesses and Memphis lie under modern farmland. At Pi-Ramesses, archaeologists uncovered stables, armories, and statues, but the main palaces are gone. They are likely below the water table. So when we talk about hidden rooms, we must also admit this. Sometimes it's not just a room. It's an entire palace, still lost underground. Now, since a pharaoh's palace was also used as a stage for ritual, some rites were public, while others were private, all tied to the king's role as divine ruler keeping Maat. At dawn, the king bathed, was anointed with oils, and dressed in fine linen by purified attendants. It looked more like a priest preparing for service than a man getting dressed. Palaces had shrines where the king made daily offerings to the gods or to his royal car. At Amarna, altars and a house of rejoicing sun court let the king honor the Aten. These acts were hidden, seen only by a select few, like a temple's inner chamber. Royal audiences followed ritual too. Officials and envoys prepared carefully. In Moriah II's tomb at Amarna, scenes show courtiers removing sandals before entering barefoot. They waited in a place of silence before stepping into the throne room. There they prostrated before the king, who was seated on a dais among painted pillars and shafts of light. Speaking required set phrases of praise. One highlight was the rewarding of officials. The king appeared at his window of appearances and threw down gold necklaces and goblets. It was staged to show royal generosity. Only courtiers saw it up close, while common people only caught a glimpse of the king. Inscriptions call him the provider of gold, like the sun. Even basic payments became theater of divine kingship. Other palace rituals marked time. The most spectacular was the Sed festival, the jubilee after 30 years on the throne. Reliefs show the king running laps in a special court to prove his strength. Then he received the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt as if newly made king. The festival renewed his reign and tied him again to divine rule. Amenhotep III's palace at Malkata was built for such festivals. He even dug the vast lake Birket Habu, which was probably used for a ritual boat ride representing the sun's journey. And you know, some Sed festival rites were secret. The king may have buried an effigy of himself, died symbolically, and returned renewed. The private part likely happened in a hidden palace shrine. But we see the public side, the race, the throne, the cheers. But the core ritual is still debated. Coronations also mixed palace and temple. In the throne room, the new king received the double crown and pledges of loyalty. He then went to temples like Karnak or Memphis for rites before the gods. Texts say he received the office in sanctuaries, and then appeared in the hall of audience to the people. And when Thutmose II shared the throne with Hatshepsut, he sat in the palace while the court rejoiced. A palace feast likely followed, which meant to symbolize unity. Later, king lists note this as the reception of the two crowns. Weddings carried similar weight. When Rameses II married a Hittite princess, a treaty recorded it. Reliefs show her being received. The palace feast was not recorded, but it likely included offerings to Hathor or Isis and her formal entry to the court. And again, secrecy shaped all these rituals. Pharaoh, who was also chief priest of every god, delegated most daily rites. But he joined in great festivals like Opet, carrying the divine bark before retreating for private rites with the statue. These moments, however, were closed to outsiders and rarely shown in art. Some believe the king renewed his divine mandate in these hidden rites. And you know, architecture mirrored this secrecy. Courtyards led into restricted halls and then to the king's private rooms. Guards also functioned as ritual protections. Spells on doorways and painted gods kept danger out. Overall, architecture and ritual worked together to present the pharaoh as priest, warrior, and god. Throne rooms often faced east to west, so the king sat in line with the sun. Morning light shining on the throne meant Ra's blessing on Horus in human form. Palace gates and courts often imitated temples. At Amarna, for instance, the great palace had a massive gateway and forecourt. The palace and king's house were tied directly to worship of the Aten. Nearby kitchens and bakeries churned out offerings in bulk. Those fed the gods and the people, making the king both provider and guardian of Maat. This use of space to show ideology lasted for centuries. Early dynastic kings, on the other hand, marked palace walls with the Serek facade. Later, it appeared in hieroglyphs, showing a palace front with Horus perched above. And as for New Kingdom palaces, they filled walls with prisoners bound in ropes, with lotus and papyrus, and with starry ceilings. These designs placed the king at the very center of the universe. At Thebes, Merempta's palace showed him striking down enemies. And so, from throne rooms to sealed chambers, every palace combined show and secrecy. Public courts displayed ma'at, hidden rooms suggested the duat, and the pharaoh moved between both worlds. In sunlight, he was a god before the crowd. In shadow, he was a lone figure in the halls. That mix of display and concealment was the real ritual. So in the end, the palace itself was the machine that made a man into a god.